he put off and put on. Take off this behavior. Don't steal, but rather work. And the fruit of your work, be generous with what you've made. Give some of that away. So put off the behavior of stealing and put on the behavior of working. That's not to earn salvation, but it's because you have been saved. I can't tell you how important that is, that you get the order right. Getting the order right in many things is incredibly important. If just look at Matthew 22, verses 36 through 40. Verse 36, a man, one of the troublemakers in Jerusalem is trying to catch Jesus, trip him up a little bit, and he asked the question, Master, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy might. This is the first and greatest commandment. The second is like unto it, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So I remember a Bible school sermon I heard preached back when I was at Gateway decades ago. The Cooling preached a message called An Answer Given for a Question Never Asked. And he talked about this second commandment. And it's not a question of whether you should do the first or the second commandment of these two great commandments, whether you should love God or love your neighbor. The answer is yes, you should love God and love your neighbor. But if you had to order them, if for some reason it was absolutely necessary for you to put them in order of importance, there's no way that you can put number 2 ahead of number 1. Number 1 has got to be number 1. You got to love God first. Doesn't mean you should forget about number 2, but you can't have number 2 first. Number 1's got to be number 1. And the book of Ephesians suggests that the indicative has always got to come before the imperative. You got to start in the right place. If you don't start in the right place, you won't get the right results. If you try to earn salvation, and I'm not talking tonight in abstracts. I see this all the time. I sit on the sidelines too much and do too much analysis, I think. Maybe it's because all I do in life is go to meetings and analyze. I think I have if it's not a committee, it's a meeting. But if I listen to funerals, I can tell you how to go to heaven by listening to funerals. Good people go to heaven. That's the theology of America. Good people go to heaven. I know that people are trying to be nice at funerals. They don't want to cause any more pain as a family struggles. But if you listen hard and say, what's the theology here? The theology is the way to get to heaven. In fact, I've heard this at funerals. If anybody will make it to heaven, this person will make it to heaven. How do we know that? Because they've been a good person. Ergo, how do you get to heaven? You be a good person. That's why it's so easy to flip the imperative with the indicative. Because everything within us says you earn the right to go to heaven. And if you've done enough good things, you can go to heaven. But that's not what Paul says. That's not how we should be formed spiritually. We should recognize that we're children of the King, and that he purchased us with a great price. And because he's purchased us, now we live as his kids. We act, we walk worthy of the vocation wherein we are called. That is what you and I are called to do, to walk worthy. And then as we go through some of the, these ways in which we're supposed to walk worthy of the vocation wherein we're called, you get to chapter 5 in verse number 18, And be not drunk with wine, wherein is excess, but be filled with the Spirit. Let me do part 2 of the English lesson. Since we've talked about imperatives and indicatives, and that was a mood, let's talk about voice. And let me talk a moment about an active voice and a passive voice. Now, many of you know that part of what I do in my life is edit books and articles and Sunday school lessons, and you know what editors struggle with, amongst other things, that's passive voice sentences. So when we teach writing, or we work with writers about how to make their writing work a little better and more engaging, we tell them all the time, make that verb active, make that verb work. You don't need a half a dozen adjectives and a few adverbs thrown in if you just get a good strong verb. And you don't need a passive verb. In fact, if you've got Microsoft Office on your computer and you're writing something, it'll probably yell at you, because even Microsoft Office knows that passive voice is not really good writing. You need that active verb. And so in this particular passage of Scripture, this verse of Scripture, Paul said, be filled with the Spirit. I know how to call my wife on the phone, but I don't know how to be called of my wife on the phone. If you said, be called of your wife, I wouldn't know what to do. If you said, call your wife, I probably don't know her number, but I know where I can find her name in my phone. I don't think I know any phone numbers anymore. She's made the favorite list. In fact, she's number 1 on the favorite list. In fact, I probably don't even hit the favorite list anymore. I say, call Marcia. But if I say, be called of Marcia, she's not going to call me. So how do we be filled with the Spirit? Be filled with the Spirit. Now, I know we're Pentecostals, and I told you Acts is a favorite book because I'm Pentecostal. So I've read Acts 2 and 10 and 11. I think it probably happened in 8, 19. So I know what it means to be born of the Spirit, born of the water and the Spirit, and I do believe that the book of Acts teaches clearly what it means to be baptized in the Spirit, and we know that happens because people speak with other tongues as the Spirit gives utterance. But is that what Paul is talking about when he says to the Ephesians in Ephesians chapter 5, verse number 18, don't be drunk with wine where is an excess, but speak in tongues? Is that what he's saying? Be speaking in tongues? Be filled with the Spirit. How does that happen? How do we be filled with the Spirit? Maybe if we look at the opposite of be filled with the Spirit, it'll give us a clue. Don't be drunk with wine wherein is excess. So he contrasts being drunk with wine with being filled with the Spirit. He doesn't say don't be filled with wine. He says don't be drunk with wine. And when you're under the influence of alcohol, your activities, and not just your activities, but your thought process are changed by whatever alcohol does to your brain. And you can't, you do certain things that you probably wouldn't do if you weren't under the influence of alcohol. We don't want people to drive cars when they're under the influence of alcohol because they can't seem to follow a straight line. amongst other things. And so, but we know that being under the influence, you don't take one drink of wine and you're under the influence of that alcohol forever and ever. After a while, the wine dissipates. The influence of that wine on your, whatever part of your brain it works on, no longer has the impact that it does. And what happens, hopefully, you've made any major disasters and got some semblance of life left, you start thinking on your own again and doing what you want to do rather than what your wine-addled brain wants you to do. So that's the contrast Paul's making here. Don't be drunk with wine where it's an excess, but be filled with the Spirit. I read a column by a guy named Andrew Wilson, and he used the analogy of a sailboat that really helped me grasp a little better perhaps what Paul was talking about, at least gave me an image that I could use to think about what it means to be filled with the Spirit. I don't have a lot of experience in sailing. I lived for 13 years on Vancouver Island, at the tip of Vancouver Island in Victoria, British Columbia, and it was a sailing town every year over what we would call Victoria Day. There would be a race called the Swift Shore Race, and sailing vessels from around the Pacific Northwest, and maybe even farther away from that, would crowd into the inner harbor at Victoria, and for a day and a half or so, they would race out to the Swift Shore lighthouse boat that was out at the end of the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and circle it and come back to Victoria. And I can remember many times we would try to be down there at the beginning of that race because often they had and the sail has just left, but the big billowy sail at the beginning, you tell I'm really good at sailing, the spinnaker. They'd have the spinnakers out that were often colorful, and it was always kind of a picture perfect as they were crossing that line, taking off for that race, and all the town was tuned into the Swift Shore Classic, the radio stations, everybody was talking about sailing, so that's about all I know about sailing. A couple other times I've been on a sailboat or two, but it's certainly different from being on a motorboat, one powered by other energy sources. And maybe that idea of sailing and the way the wind works on sailing might help us grasp a little bit of what it means to be filled with Spirit, or a little better be able to take, to fulfill Paul's imperative, be filled with the Spirit. Part of it, again, is a language lesson. This time it's not English, it's Greek and Hebrew. In Hebrew, there's really one word for spirit, wind, and breath. It's rauch. I don't see any UGST professors here, so that's how you say it. And I think I can do the other one. The New Testament, it's pneuma. In English, we have words like breath, wind, and spirit. They had one word, pneuma. It could mean breath, wind, or spirit. So when you think about being filled with the Spirit, think not about a liquid in a bottle, because that's what I would think sometimes when why do I need to keep being filled with the Spirit? Is the Spirit leaking out? Is there a hole in my bottle? Is the Spirit evaporating? Is that why I need to be filled with the Spirit? What if I think not of water or liquid, but think rather of the Spirit as wind, and think about how wind moves the sail and why I need to be filled with the Spirit? If I'm going to move, I need to be filled with the Spirit. You can spend a lot of money on a sailboat, thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars on some of those racing sailboats, and have all the latest gear and the sleekest of hulls and the most aerodynamic of rigging. But if the wind isn't blowing, the ship's not going anywhere. The only thing that moves a sailing ship is the wind. Now, I know modern sailing ships have a motor in them, but forget about modern sailing ships. Think about sailing ships when there were no motors. The only way sailing ships moved is when the wind blew. They weren't ships that had oars that you bent your back and pulled the oar through the water. You only had one way to move a ship. That was to hoist the sail and hope this wind caught the sail. First of all, you had to hope that there was wind. And then you had to learn how to capture the wind in the sail so you could move the ship forward. Does that help with this idea of being filled with the Spirit? Now, the wind's got to keep coming. So you get the sail trimmed just right. I think that's a good nautical term. You get the sail trimmed. You get the jib set. And the wind shifts. And you run over and do something else. You tighten up this line and you let this one out. You're a little more slack. The wind's lufting off the sail. So you tighten it down a little bit because you're trying to capture the wind. Now, there's a rudder that helps you steer where you're going, but the rudder doesn't propel you. The rudder only helps you go in whatever direction you go in. The only thing that moves a sailing vessel is the wind. You can't, there's nothing that the person on the ship does that makes the wind come or go. What the person on the sailing boat, the sailors have got to do is they've got to figure out how to capture the wind or how to be filled with pneuma. Be filled with pneuma. So the question is, how do you do that? Is it a habit? Or is it an experience? So the good Pentecostals, you know that we're going to argue for experience. We know what it's like when the Spirit moves on us. We pride ourselves that that's not the right. If you understand the texture I'm giving to that word, in the fact that we're a Spirit-filled church. We think you should not just capture knowledge when you come to church, but you should experience an encounter with the presence of God. We sang the second song we sang tonight was about the coming of the Spirit. So it is experience, but it also is habit. Like many things in life, it's not either or, it's both and. You need the experience of the Spirit, but you need the habits of the heart so that you can capture the wind when it blows. So you can get the sailing ship out, again, I'll just use the waters that I'm familiar with, out in the Strait of Georgia or the Juan de Fuca Strait, and the wind can be blowing. In fact, it can be blowing, at 20 knots. But if you don't know how to capture that wind when the wind is blowing, all you've got is probably tattered sails, maybe a capsized ship. But good sailors study how to capture. In fact, it was surprising to this novice sea person to know that you can almost sail directly into the oncoming wind. I would think the only way that you can sail is if the wind's behind you. That's probably how you can sail fastest. But you can almost sail directly in the wind. And so you see these sailors tacking up against the wind, capturing the wind's almost coming straight on. You can't go right straight into a wind, but almost into the wind. They set their sails in such a way that capture the wind, and it moves the ship not in the direction the wind's blowing, but in another direction altogether. And then they'll cut across this way and cut across that way, and they'll make their way into the wind because they have learned the habits of how to handle sails. So what we need to do as Christians, as Spirit-filled Christians, is we need to seek the experience, always be open to the coming of the Spirit, always invite the Spirit into our life like we did tonight when we were singing. In fact, part of what Paul's going to say in the next verse is we should sing. Sing psalms and spiritual hymns and give thanks. So part of that is what we do at worship service when we open up to the Spirit or other places in our life. But the other part that perhaps takes a little more work, if that's the right word, is to learn how the Spirit moves. Let me give you an example. It's been probably, time goes so fast anymore. I'm a little careful about when I say it was, but sometime in the recent past, the older I get, the more expansive the word recent is. Sometime in the recent past, Brother Seagraves did a series on the gifts of the Spirit. And he was very practical in how to seek to be used in the gifts of the Spirit. Kind of like very practical advice about a sailor learning how to capture the wind and how to form the habits in our life to be second nature so that we can capture the wind when it blows in our life. Don't be drunk with wine where it's an excess, but be filled with the Spirit. So my challenge to the church tonight is as we look into 2022, in whatever particular direction Pastor Bland wants to focus this church on for the next year, I promise what will help that come to pass is if all of us, you and me, are filled with the Spirit. Always seeking to be filled with the Spirit. Not just saying, well, I'd like to have an experience once every 3 years, but to be constantly filled with the Spirit so that my spiritual sails would not be slack, would not be flapping in the wind, but I would be seeking to figure out which way the wind of the Spirit is blowing so that I can capture, so I can move forward. Not long after I had been in Victoria, I was invited by the youth group of the church up the island to go on a 3-day cruise on a sailing ship called the Robertson II. Robertson II was owned by the Salt and Light Training Institute in Victoria, and it was a repurposed Grand Banks schooner. Grand Banks, Newfoundland, had been a cod fishing ship back probably a century ago, and they had refitted it, put a motor in it, and took the fish smell out. And this nonprofit group that was teaching leadership and using sailing to teach leadership sailed out of the harbor in Victoria, and they said, if I wanted to, I'd go with them, and the price was cheap, and that should have been a clue. And I signed on and said, okay, let's do it. And we left that harbor, and I found out the reason it was cheap is that we were sailing the ship. We were the crew. We were going to take a turn at hoisting anchors and raising the sails and swabbing the deck and standing watch, and I've written a little bit about that in other places, but it was, as I look back on it, sometimes the longer you get away from something, the fonder you look back on it with, but I look back at fondness on that 3-day trip. The last day, we were coming up the Strait of Georgia Strait that separates Vancouver Island from the mainland of British Columbia, and we rounded the tip of the island and entered what is known as the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and the sea was up, and the wind was blowing, and the waves were good ocean waves. And it was fun for a little while. I mean, we just got out on the bowsprit at the front of the ship, and you just see sky, and then it'd come down, you just see water. And it was just like you were riding a bucking bronco or a roller coaster, and everybody was having a great time. But after a while, landlubbers like me, my stomach didn't agree with the going up and the going down. And it was lunchtime, and they said, you can come below deck for lunch. And I said, I don't want lunch. I'm just trying to hold on to breakfast. And I wasn't successful. Breakfast went over the edge of the ship. And we were, and we're going into that headwind. We're attacking back and forth across the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And there also was a current that was in the ocean, and it was pushing us over toward Washington State. And all I wanted was the harbor. I just wanted to be in Victoria. I wanted to see my wife again. I really wanted to get my feet on something that didn't move. Get my stomach settled if I could. And it just wasn't happening. It had ceased to be fun. There is part of the trip I don't remember fondly. And if you've ever been seasick, you know what I mean. There are 2 stages to seasickness. You're so sick you think you're going to die. And the second stage is you're so sick you hope you hurry up and die. I was in the middle of that. I know I looked green. It was, no pun intended, tough sailing. But somewhere, Captain Clark decided that it just wasn't going to work anymore, that we weren't making the progress that we needed. We had a schedule to keep, and we had come up under sail power, the wind blowing, moving the sails as the skillful captain and his novice crew were moving that ship back and forth, trying to make headway against the wind that was in the other direction. We were getting closer to Washington State and farther away from Victoria. And so he did what I was so happy that he did. He took the sails down and started the engine. And we motored back to the harbor. In fact, I think he felt sorry for me. He let me kind of steer the ship into the harbor. And I think that as Christians, as we seek to be filled with the Spirit, that we should recognize that it isn't always comfortable, and that it will push us in ways that we think we never would go, and perhaps aren't even sure we want to go. The wind is not always in our back when we're following the leading of the Spirit. Being filled with the Spirit, as wonderful as it is, and often, when the Spirit moves in church and we feel the warm glow of His presence in our life, that's one way the Spirit moves. But the Spirit also nudges, and He also prods, and sometimes He kicks. And we say we want to be Spirit-led people, and we want to follow the leading of the Spirit, but we need to recognize that there comes some, I don't know if the word is danger, but uncomfortableness that comes with the leading of the Spirit, being filled with the Spirit, because you remember being drunk with wine? You're under the influence. When you're full of the Spirit, you're under the influence of the Spirit. Spirit takes over your thinking. But most of us don't surrender our own thinking easily. And so I wouldn't be surprised, like me, some of you are wishing that the sail would come down and the captain would start the motor and bring you to the harbor. That's kind of what we look for. Naturally, our inclination is for safety. It's for security. It's for things that we can control. But as 2022 comes quickly upon us, we stand on the precipice of a great adventure, and He's calling us. In fact, He's charging us as Christians to live up to our Pentecostal calling and to be filled with the Spirit. Let Him stiffen out your sails and push you where He wants you to go. He invites you to be in partnership with Him. And I'm suggesting that it would be a great idea for you to learn how the Spirit moves and how you can respond so that all of us together can move the mission of God where He wants us to go. As always, when a new year stands just in front of us, it stands with great opportunity, with great excitement, with freshness and wonder about what God can do in 2022. I promise He can do more with you if you'll yield to His Spirit than you can do without his presence. Let's stand together tonight. Lord, thank you, first of all, for the gift of the Spirit in our life. Thank you for allowing us to be Pentecostal, for the wonderful gift of your presence in our life, for the warm glow of the Spirit that we often feel as we worship together in church, as we live our lives as people who are committed to the Spirit. But I asked personally for me and for this church that this year we would work a little harder at being filled with your Spirit, to learn a little more skill at capturing which way you want us to move and how you want us to bend to your will. I pray, God, that this would be, amongst other things in 2022, a wonderfully Spirit-filled, Spirit-empowered church. And we ask it in your name, Jesus. Amen. Amen. Lord bless you.